You know, when people ask us how we survived what our own son tried to do to us, I tell them the truth. We survived because we never forgot who we were. My name is Richard, and this is my wife of 47 years, Catherine. We built everything from nothing, and when our boy tried to take it all away, he forgot one crucial thing. The foundation he stood on was ours, not his.
I remember the exact moment I knew something had changed in Daniel. It wasn't a dramatic fight or a shouted insult, it was something quieter, something that cut deeper. He stopped looking us in the eye. When your own child can't meet your gaze anymore, that's when you know the poison has spread too far. His wife, Victoria, she was the architect of it all, but Daniel, he chose to follow her blueprint.
They thought we were just two old fools who'd hand everything over like lambs to slaughter. 43 years, we spent building Montgomery and Associates from a single carpentry shop into a commercial construction firm worth $12 million. Every brick we laid, every client we earned, every sleepless night balancing books while Daniel was at private school learning tennis and French. None of that mattered to him anymore.
The worst part wasn't the greed. We could have forgiven ambition, Richard and I, we understood wanting success. The worst part was the contempt. Victoria called us the old furniture once, thinking we couldn't hear. Daniel laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a genuine, agreeing laugh. That's when I knew we'd lost our son, and we needed to save ourselves.
What you're about to hear isn't a revenge story. It's a survival story. When your own blood decides you're disposable, you have two choices. Lie down and let them bury you, or stand up and remind them exactly who taught them to walk in the first place. We chose to stand. And what happened next? Well, let's just say Daniel learned a very expensive lesson about underestimating the people who gave him everything.
This story isn't easy to tell, even now, 3 years later. But we share it because somewhere out there, another parent might be going through the same thing, feeling invisible, feeling discarded, wondering if they're crazy for sensing the change. You're not crazy. Trust your instincts. And remember, the children you raised might forget your worth, but you should never forget it yourself.
The first crack appeared on a Tuesday evening in March, during what was supposed to be a simple family dinner. Richard and Catherine had driven 40 minutes from their modest colonial home in Willow Creek to Daniel and Victoria's newly purchased estate in Ashford Heights, a sprawling 6,000-square-foot monument to excess that Daniel had bought 3 months earlier, immediately after being promoted to vice president of operations at Montgomery and Associates. Catherine had brought her famous lemon rosemary chicken, the same dish she'd made for Daniel's birthday every year since he was 7. She'd spent the afternoon preparing it, even though her arthritis made chopping herbs an ordeal. Richard had picked up a bottle of Cabernet from the wine shop Daniel had mentioned liking, something French with a label Richard couldn't pronounce, but that cost more than their weekly grocery budget. They arrived at 6:30 sharp, as requested. Victoria answered the door wearing what Catherine estimated was a $3,000 cocktail dress for a casual Tuesday dinner. Her smile was perfectly practiced, the kind you'd give to distant acquaintances rather than your husband's parents. "Oh, you brought food," Victoria said, eyeing the casserole dish with barely concealed distaste. "How thoughtful. Though I should mention we're doing a completely organic, plant-based menu tonight. Our nutritionist says animal proteins are inflammatory." She didn't offer to take the dish, leaving Catherine standing in the doorway, holding it like an unwanted gift. Richard felt his jaw tighten, but said nothing. Catherine forced brightness into her voice. "That's wonderful, dear. I could just put this in your refrigerator for another time." She stepped inside without waiting for permission, years of raising a strong-willed child having taught her when to push forward. The house was absurdly large for 2 people. Their footsteps echoed across Italian marble floors as Victoria led them through a foyer that could have held Richard and Catherine's entire living room. Abstract art that looked like expensive accidents hung on walls painted in shades of gray that probably had pretentious names like Smoke Whisper or Urban Fog. Daniel was in what Victoria called the Great Room, a cavernous space with 20-foot ceilings and windows overlooking a pool that glowed an unnatural blue in the gathering dusk. He was on his phone, Pacing, his voice carrying that clipped, irritated tone Richard recognized from business calls gone wrong. "I don't care what Henderson said. The bid goes through at our number or not at all." Daniel snapped into the phone. He glanced up as his parents entered, gave a distracted wave, and turned his back to continue the conversation. Not a hug, not even a proper greeting. Just a wave, the kind you'd give to someone you vaguely recognized at a coffee shop. Catherine's smile faltered. Richard placed a hand on the small of her back. A silent gesture of solidarity they perfected over decades of facing difficulties together. They stood there, awkward and unacknowledged, while their son negotiated business deals in a home they'd helped him earn the position to afford. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Victoria had disappeared somewhere, leaving them standing like forgotten guests. Finally, Daniel ended his call and pocketed his phone. "Sorry about that. Crisis at the Riverside project." He checked his watch, a Rolex Richard didn't recognize, something new and flashy. "We should probably eat soon. Victoria has Pilates at 8. No apology for the wait. No inquiry about their drive or their health. Just a schedule to keep, with them as minor inconveniences to be managed efficiently. Richard noticed his son had filled out since they'd last seen him 6 weeks ago. Not with muscle, but with the soft weight of expensive restaurant meals and sedentary authority. His hair was different too, styled with some product that made it look intentionally messy in a way that probably cost a fortune. They sat at a dining table that could have seated 14, but somehow made the four of them feel isolated from each other. Victoria served what she called a deconstructed Buddha bowl, various vegetables and grains artfully arranged in separate piles that were apparently meant to be mixed together, though no one explained this until Catherine had eaten each component separately, wondering if she was doing it wrong. The conversation was surface level and stilted. Victoria talked extensively about their interior designer's vision for the third-floor reading nook. Daniel mentioned the company's quarterly earnings, speaking about Montgomery and Associates as though it were some corporation he'd discovered rather than the business his parents had built from nothing. Neither asked Richard or Catherine a single question about their lives. Halfway through the meal, Richard attempted to bridge the growing chasm. "I was thinking about the Henderson account you mentioned," he said, leaning forward with genuine interest. "If you're having trouble with the bid, I remember Henderson's father from when we—" "Dad, no offense, but the Henderson we're dealing with isn't running his father's hardware store anymore," Daniel interrupted, not looking up from his phone, which he'd placed beside his plate and kept glancing at. "This is corporate-level negotiation. Different world." The dismissal was casual, almost absent-minded, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been deliberately cruel. Richard felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but kept his expression neutral. 43 years of business dealings had taught him not to react in the moment, to think before responding. Catherine tried next, turning to Victoria with determined cheerfulness. "How's your mother doing, dear? Richard and I were thinking of sending her a card for her birthday next month." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh, Mother's in Santorini right now, actually. She's renting a villa for the season. We're joining her in June. Just the two of us," she added, with emphasis that made the exclusion clear. "She finds these family gatherings so exhausting, you know? All the expectations." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Catherine's smile remained frozen, but Richard saw the hurt flash through her eyes before she concealed it. His hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. They'd faced bankruptcy threats and economic recessions together. They could survive a dinner with their son and his wife. But as the evening wore on, Richard began to understand that this wasn't just a bad dinner. This was a message. The second incident came 3 weeks later, during what was supposed to be a routine business meeting. Richard had officially retired from day-to-day operations 5 years earlier, when he turned 65, but he'd maintained his position as chairman of the board and still came to the office twice a week to review major decisions. It was his company, after all. His name was still on the building, even if Daniel now occupied the corner office that Richard had worked 30 years to earn. That morning, Richard arrived at 8 o'clock, as he had for 4 decades. The receptionist, Melissa, who'd worked for Montgomery and Associates for 12 years, greeted him with her usual warmth, but Richard noticed something odd in her expression. Sympathy? Discomfort? Before he could analyze it, she quickly busied herself with paperwork. Richard made his way to the conference room where the monthly board meeting was scheduled. The board consisted of himself, Catherine, who'd been secretary-treasurer since the beginning, Daniel, and two outside advisors they brought on 3 years ago when the company expanded. As Richard pushed open the heavy oak door, he found the meeting already in progress. Daniel stood at the head of the table, mid-presentation, a projection screen behind him showing financial charts. The two outside advisors, Marcus Chun and Patricia Holloway, sat taking notes. Catherine's usual seat, third chair on the right, where she'd sat for 43 years, was occupied by Victoria, who was dressed in a severe black pantsuit that made her look like she was attending a funeral. Everyone turned as Richard entered. An awkward silence fell over the room. Daniel's jaw tightened briefly before he arranged his features into a professional smile. "Dad, you're early." Richard checked his watch pointedly. Meeting was called for 8. "It's 8:05. "Right, well, we started a bit ahead of schedule. I emailed everyone about the time change last Friday." Daniel's tone was perfectly reasonable, which made the lie more insulting. Richard checked his phone every evening. There had been no email. Catherine wasn't there at all. Richard's stomach tightened with a cold premonition. "Where's your mother?" Victoria spoke up, her voice carrying the particular crispness of someone delivering practice lines. "Catherine is no longer required at board meetings. We're streamlining operations, cutting unnecessary redundancies. I'll be assuming her secretarial duties going forward, as I have an MBA from Wharton and actual corporate governance experience." The casual dismissal of 4 decades of Catherine's work hit Richard like a physical blow. His wife had managed every financial detail of Montgomery & Associates, had balanced books during years when balance meant choosing between paying suppliers or making payroll, had worked 16-hour days while simultaneously raising a child and keeping their household running. "Catherine isn't just a secretary," Richard said quietly, the dangerous calm in his voice making Marcus and Patricia exchange nervous glances. "She's an officer of this company and a board member. You can't simply replace her." Daniel cleared his throat, pulling a document from his leather portfolio. "Actually, Dad, we can. And we have. I had our lawyers draw up paperwork restructuring the board composition. As majority shareholder and acting CEO, I have the authority to modify board membership as I see fit for the company's optimal functioning." The word majority shareholder landed like a punch. Richard's mind raced. He'd transferred 60% of his shares to Daniel 3 years ago, part of an estate planning strategy their accountant had recommended for tax purposes. It had seemed wise at the time. Daniel was their only child, and eventually, he'd inherit everything anyway. But Richard had kept 40% specifically to maintain influence and oversight. "Majority shareholder doesn't give you unilateral authority," Richard said, struggling to keep his voice level. "Board composition requires a vote." "Which we've already held," Victoria interjected, her smile sharp as a blade. Marcus and Patricia both voted in favor. 3 votes to 1. She didn't say it, but the implication was clear. Richard's single vote was meaningless now. Richard looked at the 2 advisors he'd trusted, had mentored, had treated fairly for years. Marcus wouldn't meet his eyes, suddenly fascinated by his pen. Patricia at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "It's just business, Richard," she murmured. "Nothing personal." The meeting continued as though Richard weren't there, as though his presence was a formality to be tolerated rather than respected. Daniel presented a restructuring plan that involved modernizing the company's approach, which apparently meant eliminating several veteran employees who'd been with Montgomery & Associates for decades, people Richard considered friends as much as colleagues. Richard forced himself to stay silent and observe. His father had taught him long ago that you learn more by watching than by reacting. He noted how Victoria and Daniel exchanged subtle glances, how they'd clearly rehearsed this performance. He noticed how the financial projections on the screen included several questionable assumptions about growth rates and market conditions. Most importantly, he noticed the new line item buried in the operational expenses, executive consulting fees to the tune of $300,000 annually, payable to VDM Consulting, Victoria's initials. They were looting the company, or at least preparing to. This wasn't about streamlining or modernization. This was about extracting as much wealth as possible, as quickly as possible. Richard's blood ran cold as he understood the full scope of what was happening. His son wasn't just dismissing him and Catherine. He was preparing to gut the company they'd spent a lifetime building. When the meeting finally ended, Richard remained seated as the others filed out. Daniel lingered, clearly steeling himself for a confrontation. "Dad, I know this is hard for you to accept, but businesses evolve. You and Mom did an incredible job building this company from the ground up, but what got us here won't get us where we need to go. You need to trust that I know what I'm doing." The condescension in his son's voice was almost worse than outright hostility. Richard stood slowly, drawing himself to his full height. Even at 71, he was still an imposing figure, broad-shouldered from decades of physical labor before the business had grown large enough to hire construction crews. He looked his son directly in the eye. "When you were 7 years old, you broke your arm falling out of the treehouse I'd built for you," Richard said quietly. "Do you remember what I told you at the hospital?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the non sequitur. "What?" "No, I told you that pain is information. It tells you when something is wrong, when you need to pay attention and change course." Richard picked up his briefcase. "You're causing your mother and me a great deal of pain right now, son. I suggest you think carefully about what information that's giving you." He walked out before Daniel could respond, maintaining his dignity even as his world crumbled. He found his car in the parking lot, still the same spot he'd parked in for 30 years, though now his name had been removed from the reserve sign, and sat behind the wheel for several minutes, hands shaking with suppressed rage and heartbreak. Then he called Catherine and told her to meet him at home immediately. They needed to have a very serious conversation about their son. Catherine was waiting in their kitchen when Richard arrived, her face already pale with worry from his cryptic phone call. She'd been gardening, her therapy, she called it, and dirt still stained the knees of her jeans. For 47 years, Richard had loved her practical nature, the way she found peace in simple things while he charged ahead building empires. Now, looking at her worried expression, he hated that he had to shatter that peace. He told her everything, about being excluded from the meeting, about Victoria taking her position, about the financial restructuring that smelled of embezzlement. Catherine listened in silence, her hands folded on the kitchen table, occasionally touching the simple gold wedding band she'd worn since 1978. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to the kitchen window overlooking her garden, and spoke without turning around. "I knew," she said softly. "I've known something was wrong for months. I just didn't want to believe my son could be this person." Richard joined her at the window. "What do you mean?" Catherine's reflection in the glass showed tears streaming down her face, though her voice remained steady. 3 weeks ago, I went to the office to drop off those files you'd forgotten. I heard Victoria talking to Daniel in his office. The door was cracked open. They didn't know I was there. She paused, swallowing hard. She said, "Once we get the old woman completely out of the picture, we can start liquidating assets. Your father won't know what's happening until it's too late to stop." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Richard felt a cold fury building in his chest, different from the hot anger he'd felt earlier. This was calculated, deliberate. His son wasn't just being thoughtlessly cruel or ambitious. He was actively planning to destroy them. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked gently. "Because I kept hoping I'd misunderstood. Because I wanted to believe there was some explanation that didn't mean our son was stealing from us." Catherine turned to face him, her eyes red but fierce. "But there isn't, is there? Daniel and Victoria are planning to take everything we built and push us out completely. And we've made it easy for them by trusting family over business sense." Richard pulled her into an embrace, feeling her shoulders shake with silent sobs. They stood there for several minutes, mourning not just their financial situation, but something far more precious: the loss of the child they'd raised, or at least the loss of who they believed him to be. That evening, they did something they rarely did. They drank. Richard poured 2 generous whiskeys, and they sat on their back porch watching the sunset, the same porch where they'd celebrated countless victories and weathered numerous storms. The house around them was modest by current standards: 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, built in 1985 when the business was just starting to succeed. They'd paid off the mortgage in 15 years through sheer determination and sacrifice. Daniel had grown up here, had learned to ride his bike on this driveway, had brought friends to swim in the above-ground pool they'd installed one sweltering summer. "Remember when we almost lost everything in '93? Catherine said, her voice slightly roughened by the whiskey. "The Mason project fell through, and we had $300,000 in loans coming due." Richard nodded. "I worked double shifts for 6 months. You took that job at the diner waitressing nights." Daniel was 10. He never knew how close we came to bankruptcy. We made sure he never felt scared or uncertain. Catherine laughed bitterly. "We protected him from the struggle, and now he thinks success just happens. He thinks we're obsolete because we're old-fashioned, because we still believe in things like loyalty and fairness. He doesn't remember what we gave up for him," Richard said quietly. "The vacations we never took, the house renovations we delayed, the retirement we postponed. Every dollar went into that business or into giving him opportunities we never had. Private school, summer camps, college without debt. He took a long drink, and now he's going to take it all and discard us like we're trash." They sat in silence as darkness fell, the automatic lights in their yard clicking on one by one. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice carrying a resolve Richard recognized from 47 years of partnership. "So what do we do?" Richard turned to look at his wife, this woman who'd stood beside him through every fight, every failure, every triumph. She wasn't asking whether they should fight back. She was asking how. And in that moment, Richard felt a weight lift from his chest. He wasn't alone. He'd never been alone. "We do what we've always done," he said. "We work smarter, we plan carefully, and we survive. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for: James Patterson, a lawyer they'd used years ago for contract negotiations, a man who'd since moved into corporate litigation. "Tomorrow, I'm going to have a very interesting conversation with our attorney. And then we're going to find out precisely what rights we actually have versus what Daniel thinks we have." Catherine nodded, setting her empty glass on the porch railing. "And what about Daniel himself? Do we confront him? Try to talk to him?" Richard considered this carefully. Every instinct as a father screamed to sit his son down, to demand an explanation, to force him to see reason. But he'd been in business long enough to know that showing your hand too early was the fastest way to lose. "No, we let him think he's winning. People get careless when they think they've already won. They make mistakes. I don't know if I can look at him and pretend everything's fine," Catherine admitted. "You won't have to," Richard said grimly. "I suspect they're going to keep pushing us away anyway. Our job is to stay quiet, stay observant, and gather information." He reached for her hand. "Can you do that? Can you trust me on this?" Catherine met his eyes, and he saw the steel that had always been there beneath her gentle exterior. "I've trusted you for 47 years through much worse than this. I'm not stopping now." The next morning, Richard sat in James Patterson's downtown office, a sleek space of glass and chrome that spoke of success. James himself had aged well, still sharp-eyed and energetic at 62, his salt and pepper hair giving him a distinguished air. He listened intently as Richard explained the situation, taking occasional notes, but mostly just absorbing the information with the practiced patience of someone who'd heard countless variations of family business disasters. When Richard finished, James leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This is more common than you'd think. Family businesses are particularly vulnerable to this kind of internal coup, especially when the founders start transitioning power to the next generation. Let me ask you something crucial. When you transferred those shares to Daniel 3 years ago, what were the exact terms? Richard pulled out his phone, where he'd photographed the relevant documents before leaving home. The transfer gave him 60% of voting shares, with a clause that I maintain board chairman authority for life unless incapacitated. James took the phone, studying the image carefully. His expression shifted subtly, not quite a smile, but something close to satisfaction. And do you have any documentation of the board restructuring Daniel implemented? The vote that removed Catherine? They said it was already done. 3 votes to 1. Daniel, Victoria, and the 2 outside advisors. But do you have documentation? James pressed. Minutes from that vote? Official notice? Anything in writing? Richard paused, replaying the meeting in his mind. No, Daniel mentioned it, but I was never shown actual documentation. I was just told it had been voted on. Now, James did smile, and it wasn't pleasant. That's their first mistake. Corporate governance requires proper documentation and notice. You can't just announce a board restructuring without following specific legal procedures. If they didn't provide you and Catherine with written notice at least 10 days prior to the vote per your company's bylaws, then that vote is invalid. Hope flickered in Richard's chest, but he kept it cautious. What does that mean practically? It means Catherine is still a board member, and any decisions made under the assumption that she wasn't are challengeable. It also means we need to look very carefully at every action Daniel has taken recently. James turned to his computer, making notes. You mentioned consulting fees to Victoria's company. Has that expenditure been formally approved by the full, legitimate board? I don't know. I've been kept out of the loop. Then we need to find out. Richard, I'm going to be blunt with you. What your son is doing could constitute corporate malfeasance, possibly even fraud, depending on how deep this goes. But we need evidence, and we need to move carefully. If you go in accusatorially right now, he'll cover his tracks. James leaned forward. I need you to do something difficult. I need you to give me access to company records without alerting Daniel that you're doing it. Richard felt uncomfortable about what felt like spying, but James quickly clarified. You're still chairman and a 40% shareholder. You have every legal right to review company documents. We're not doing anything wrong. We're exercising your legitimate oversight authority. The question is whether we can do it without tipping Daniel off that we're building a case. They spent the next hour strategizing. James explained that Richard needed to request a comprehensive audit, something he could justify as routine chairman oversight. He also needed to document every interaction with Daniel, every decision made without proper board approval, every instance of being excluded from company operations. Catherine should do the same, keeping detailed records of her ouster from the board and any subsequent attempts to access company information. This is going to get ugly, James warned. Family lawsuits always do. Are you prepared for that? For your son to hate you, for this to become public, for the potential media attention if Montgomery and Associates' internal drama becomes gossip. Richard thought of Catherine's face the previous evening, the tears she'd shed over her garden. He thought of 43 years of labor, of the employees who depended on Montgomery and Associates for their livelihoods, of the legacy he'd built not for himself but for future generations, including grandchildren he might never have now. I'm prepared to protect what we built, he said firmly. And if that means fighting my son in court, then yes. I'm prepared. James nodded approvingly. Good. Then let's talk about something else you need to understand. Worst-case scenarios. If this goes to full litigation, Daniel could attempt to force a buyout of your shares. Given that he has majority control, he might argue that your presence is disruptive to company operations and try to compel you to sell at whatever price the court deems fair. The thought made Richard's stomach turn. Can he do that? Potentially, yes, which is why we need to move fast and move smart. We need to establish that Daniel is the problem, not you. We need to document that he's the one acting improperly, that he's mismanaging company assets, that his actions are damaging rather than beneficial. James pulled up a document on his screen. I'm going to draft a formal request for an independent audit of company finances for the past 3 years. As chairman, You have the authority to commission this. Daniel can't legally refuse without raising serious red flags. Richard felt the pieces clicking into place. An independent audit would uncover the consulting fees, any other suspicious transactions, and create an official record of either proper management or malfeasance. How long will that take? The audit itself? Probably 6 to 8 weeks once we get a firm on board. But the interesting part happens before that. The moment Daniel receives notification that an audit has been commissioned, he's going to panic. People doing shady things always panic when they know someone's about to look at the books. He'll either scramble to cover his tracks, which might involve actions we can document, or he'll try to block the audit entirely, which would be a massive tactical error on his part. Catherine would need to be brought fully into this strategy. That evening, Richard laid out everything James had explained. They sat at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd made countless business decisions over the decades, and Catherine listened with the focused intensity she'd always brought to their partnership. The audit request went out on a Wednesday morning, delivered by courier to ensure documentation of receipt. Richard had drafted it carefully with James's guidance, framing it as routine governance rather than an investigation. In fulfillment of my fiduciary responsibilities as chairman and significant shareholder, I am commissioning a comprehensive independent audit of Montgomery & Associates' financial operations, management decisions, and corporate governance practices for the period January 2022 through present. Daniel called within 2 hours. Richard let it go to voicemail. Then came a text. "We need to talk immediately. This audit is completely unnecessary and disruptive." Richard didn't respond. The silence was strategic. Let Daniel stew. Let him wonder what Richard knew or suspected. The second call came that evening at 9:30 when Richard and Catherine were watching the news. This time Richard answered, putting it on speaker so Catherine could hear. "Hello, Daniel. What the hell are you doing?" His son's voice was tight, with barely controlled anger. "Do you have any idea what an independent audit will do to company operations? We're in the middle of 3 major projects. This could delay everything, cost us clients." "Then there's nothing to worry about," Richard said calmly. "If everything is being managed properly, an audit will simply confirm that. It's standard corporate governance for a company of our size. I should have commissioned 1 year ago. This is about the board restructuring, isn't it?" Daniel's tone shifted, becoming cajoling. "Dad, I know you're upset about Mom, but that was a business decision. Nothing personal. If you'd been at the meetings regularly, you'd understand the reasoning." "I was never notified of any meetings," Richard interrupted, his voice still perfectly level. "Neither was your mother. In fact, we never received any written documentation about the board restructuring at all, which is interesting, since corporate bylaws require 10 days written notice before any such vote." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Richard thought Daniel might have hung up. Finally, "Who had you been talking to? Patterson? Did you go to James Patterson?" The fear in his son's voice was palpable. "I've been talking to our company attorney about proper governance procedures," Richard said. "Something I should have been doing all along. The audit stands, Daniel. If you want to discuss this further, you can contact Mr. Patterson directly. Good night." He ended the call before Daniel could respond. Catherine reached across the couch and squeezed his hand. "That was hard for you." "Yes," Richard admitted, "but necessary." His phone buzzed again, another call from Daniel. Richard silenced it. Then came a text from Victoria. "This vendetta you're pursuing is pathetic and will only hurt everyone, including yourself." Richard showed it to Catherine, who shook her head in disgust. "She's scared," Catherine observed. "People who aren't doing anything wrong don't react like this." Over the next week, the situation escalated rapidly. Daniel tried multiple times to reach Richard, switching between anger and attempted reconciliation. The messages became increasingly desperate. "Dad, please, let's sit down and talk about this like adults. You're going to destroy the company over a misunderstanding. Mom, can you please talk some sense into him?" Catherine, who'd always been the mediator in family conflicts, surprised herself with how easily she maintained silence. Perhaps it was because she'd heard Victoria's voice in Daniel's office, plotting their removal. Perhaps it was simply that she'd reached the end of her capacity for being disrespected. Either way, she stood firm beside Richard. The audit firm, Morrison and Associates, began their preliminary work. They requested access to financial records, board minutes, and documentation of major expenditures. James had chosen them specifically because they were thorough and unafraid of controversy. The lead auditor, a sharp woman named Patricia Morrison, met with Richard and Catherine personally to understand the scope of their concerns. "I'm going to be frank with you," Patricia said during their initial meeting. "In 90% of these family business situations, what we find is a combination of poor documentation, some questionable judgment calls, but nothing criminal. However, there's usually enough irregularity to negotiate a fair settlement between parties." She pulled out her tablet, showing them a preliminary timeline. The remaining 10%, those involve actual fraud, embezzlement, or gross malfeasance. Based on what you've told me, I'd say you're looking at somewhere in the middle, significant mismanagement with possible legal implications. Richard leaned forward. "What should we be prepared for?" "Resistance, possibly hostility. If your son has been diverting funds or misrepresenting company finances, he's going to do everything possible to slow down our work. We might encounter lost documents, delayed access, claims that files are privileged or confidential." Patricia's expression was professional but sympathetic. "This is where it gets difficult. We have legal authority to access records, but family members have ways of making that access complicated. How you personally handle that will determine how smoothly this process goes." Catherine spoke up, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "What you're really asking is whether we're truly committed to seeing this through, regardless of the personal cost." Patricia nodded. "Exactly. Because once this audit reveals problems, and I strongly suspect it will, you'll face a choice. You can use those findings to negotiate a quiet settlement, possibly buying Daniel out or vice versa. Or you can pursue legal action, which means potential criminal referrals, public litigation, and almost certainly the permanent destruction of your relationship with your son." She looked between them. Most parents choose the settlement. They decide that family, however broken, matters more than money or justice. And I'm not judging that choice. It's perfectly valid. Richard and Catherine exchanged a long look, one of those wordless conversations that decades of marriage enabled. Finally, Richard turned back to Patricia. "We want the truth, whatever it is. What happens after that, we'll decide when we know what we're dealing with. But we're not backing down just because it's uncomfortable." "Understood," Patricia said, making a note. "Then let's proceed with full transparency. I'll need comprehensive access to your company's financial systems, and I'd recommend you prepare for the possibility that this gets much worse before it gets better." Okay, the first major discovery came 3 weeks into the audit process. Patricia Morrison called Richard on a Friday afternoon, her voice carefully neutral in the way professionals use when they're about to deliver very bad news. "Richard, I need you and Catherine to come to my office first thing Monday morning. And you should bring James Patterson with you." That weekend was one of the longest of Richard's life. He and Catherine tried to maintain normalcy. She worked in her garden, he organized his workshop, but the tension was constant. They didn't speculate out loud about what Patricia had found, but both of them knew it had to be significant. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching their mood. James met them in Morrison and Associates lobby, briefcase in hand, his expression already set in the grim determination of a lawyer preparing for battle. Patricia ushered them into a conference room where she'd laid out dozens of documents, printouts, and spreadsheets across the large table. "I'm going to be direct," Patricia began without preamble. "What we've uncovered goes beyond poor management or questionable judgment. This is systematic financial manipulation." She pulled forward a thick folder. "Let's start with VDM Consulting, Victoria's company. According to your company records, Montgomery & Associates has paid VDM Consulting $780,000 over the past 18 months. Catherine gasped. Richard felt the room tilt slightly. "For what services?" "That's the interesting part. The invoices are incredibly vague. Strategic consulting, operational optimization, executive advisory services. We requested supporting documentation, reports, analyses, deliverables, anything showing what work was actually performed. We received nothing because, and this is where it becomes fraud, there is no evidence any work was done. Victoria billed your company almost $800,000 for services that appear to be entirely fictitious. James was already making notes, his jaw tight. That's textbook embezzlement. What else? Patricia moved to another stack of documents. Executive compensation. Daniel increased his own salary from $150,000 to $375,000 annually, plus bonuses totaling another $200,000 last year. None of these increases were approved by the full board, just by himself and the two advisors, both of whom received their own substantial raises at the same time. Buying loyalty, Richard said quietly. Exactly. Marcus Chin's compensation went from $80,000 to $140,000. Patricia Holloway's from $75,000 to $120,000. Both raises coinciding exactly with the board restructuring that removed Catherine. Patricia pulled out another file. But here's what concerns me most. We've identified 3 separate instances where company assets were sold at below market value to entities that trace back to Daniel and Victoria. She spread out property records. Last year, Montgomery & Associates sold 2 commercial properties, the warehouse on Industrial Boulevard and the office building on Maple Street. Both properties were appraised at fair market value by your company's regular appraiser. But then Daniel commissioned second appraisals from a different firm, one owned by Victoria's college roommate. These appraisals came in 30% lower. The properties were then sold at those depressed prices to an LLC called Ashford Holdings. Let me guess, James said. Daniel and Victoria own Ashford Holdings. 50-50 partnership, registered in Delaware to obscure ownership. They bought company assets cheap, using their control of the board to approve the sales, and they now own properties worth approximately $2.3 million that they paid only $1.6 million for. And here's the truly audacious part. They use company funds for the down payment, structured as a business loan that has remarkably favorable terms and no set repayment schedule. Richard stood abruptly, walking to the window overlooking downtown. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the city below into watercolor smears. He'd built Montgomery & Associates on principles of honesty and fair dealing. He'd turned down profitable but ethically questionable projects. He'd prided himself on treating employees, clients, and competitors with integrity. And his son, the child he'd raised, had tried to instill with those same values, had turned the company into his personal theft operation. How much total? Richard asked without turning around. How much have they stolen? Patricia consulted her notes. Based on what we've documented so far, approximately $2.8 million in various forms. The fake consulting fees, the property transfers, inflated expenses, and several smaller transactions we're still tracing. But Richard, we're only 3 weeks into this audit. There's almost certainly more we haven't found yet. Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. $3 million. We worked 43 years to build something worth $12 million, and he's stolen a quarter of it in 18 months. She looked up at Patricia. How much more could there be? I don't know yet, but I can tell you this. The pattern of behavior suggests someone who's gotten comfortable with theft, who's escalated over time. The earliest questionable transactions were smaller, more carefully disguised. The recent ones show more confidence, more carelessness. That's typical of embezzlers. They start small, and when they get away with it, they get bolder. James closed his notebook. We have more than enough for criminal referral. This isn't a civil disagreement about business strategy. This is fraud, embezzlement, and self-dealing. Richard, Catherine, you need to decide right now how you want to proceed. We can go to the police, we can file a civil suit, or we can confront Daniel privately and demand restitution. But you cannot do nothing. Richard turned back to the table. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it felt almost cleansing. I want to know everything. Every transaction, every lie, every dollar. I want documentation so thorough that Daniel can't deny a single detail. He looked at James. "And then I want to give him one chance to make this right before we destroy him publicly. Not because he deserves it, but because despite everything, I'm still his father." Catherine reached for his hand. "And if he refuses? If he fights us? Then we go to war," Richard said simply. "And we win." Patricia needed another 3 weeks to complete the full audit. During that time, Daniel made several more attempts at contact, each more desperate than the last. He showed up at their house twice, once alone, once with Victoria. Both times, Richard refused to let them pass the doorway. The second visit was particularly ugly. Victoria, her composure finally cracking, had screamed from the driveway, "You're a bitter old man who can't accept that your time is over. Daniel has tripled your revenue in 3 years, and all you can do is tear him down out of jealousy." Catherine, watching from the living room window, had nearly laughed at the absurdity. Tripled revenue by stealing from the company he's running. That's not business genius. That's just theft with a business card. The completed audit report arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-June, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope marked confidential. Richard and Catherine sat together at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd made every major decision for nearly 5 decades, and read through all 67 pages. The final tally was worse than they'd imagined. $3.4 million in confirmed fraudulent transactions, plus another $800,000 in questionable expenses that couldn't be definitively proven but followed suspicious patterns. Daniel and Victoria had systematically looted Montgomery and Associates while presenting a facade of increased profitability by cutting employee benefits, deferring maintenance, and delaying vendor payments. Several long-term employees had been fired not for performance issues, as Daniel had claimed, but because they'd asked uncomfortable questions about financial irregularities. The company's apparent growth was smoke and mirrors. Revenue had indeed increased, but profit margins had been gutted by the theft and mismanagement. "There's something else here," Catherine said, pointing to a section near the end of the report. The auditors flag several upcoming financial obligations, insurance renewals, equipment loans, vendor contracts that are coming due in the next 6 months. They estimate Montgomery and Associates needs approximately $1.7 million in liquid capital to meet these obligations without taking emergency loans. Richard saw where she was going. "But Daniel and Victoria have drained the reserves." "Exactly, which means in about 4 months, the company is going to face a serious cash flow crisis. If Daniel can't secure emergency financing, Montgomery and Associates could be forced into bankruptcy or fire sale liquidation." Catherine's eyes widened. "Richard, what if that's a plan? What if they've been deliberately bleeding the company dry so they can force a bankruptcy, buy the assets at pennies on the dollar, and restart under a different name?" It was diabolical enough to be plausible. Richard pulled out his phone and called James Patterson. "We need to meet today. I think we've figured out the end game, and it's worse than we thought." That afternoon, the 4 of them, Richard, Catherine, James, and Patricia, convened in James's office. After hearing Richard and Catherine's theory, Patricia nodded grimly. "It fits the pattern we've seen in other cases. Drain the company of assets and cash, let it fail, then acquire everything through bankruptcy proceedings. The creditors get cents on the dollar, the original owners get wiped out, and the people who caused the bankruptcy end up owning everything." "Can we stop it?" Catherine asked. James tapped his pen against his legal pad. "Yes, but not quietly. We need to move immediately to remove Daniel from operational control before he can do any more damage. That means filing for a court-ordered injunction, which requires revealing the audit findings publicly. It means Daniel and Victoria will know exactly what we've found, and they'll have time to prepare their defense." "What's the alternative?" Richard asked. "We confront Daniel privately, show him the audit, and demand immediate repayment of the stolen funds plus his resignation. We can offer not to pursue criminal charges if he complies fully. It's cleaner, faster, and avoids destroying the company's reputation." James leaned back in his chair. "But it relies on Daniel being reasonable, which history suggests he won't be." Richard stood and walked to James's bookshelf, studying the leather-bound legal volumes without really seeing them. He thought about the young man who'd fallen out of the tree house, who'd cried when his goldfish died, who'd given a speech at his high school graduation thanking his parents for their sacrifices. That boy was gone, if he'd ever truly existed outside of Richard's hopeful imagination. The man Daniel had become was a stranger, someone capable of looking his parents in the eye while plotting their financial destruction. We confront him, Richard decided. One last chance. But we do it with everything documented, with witnesses present, and with the understanding that if he refuses or tries to negotiate, we go immediately to court and to the police. Catherine joined him, placing her hand on his shoulder. I agree. He's our son. We owe him that much. But after this, if he chooses his greed over making things right, then we owe him nothing. James began organizing documents. I'll arrange a meeting for this Friday in my office. Neutral ground, recorded for legal purposes with myself and Patricia present as witnesses. I'll send Daniel a formal notice that he's required to attend a meeting regarding urgent company matters requiring immediate resolution. He'll probably bring Victoria and possibly his own attorney. Good, Richard said. Let him bring whoever he wants. The truth doesn't change based on audience size. The meeting was scheduled for Friday at 2 o'clock. James had chosen his largest conference room, one with a recording system built into the ceiling for depositions. The table was massive, designed for complex litigation involving multiple parties. Today, it would host something more primal, a family destruction documented in legal terms. Richard and Catherine arrived 15 minutes early. They sat on one side of the table, James and Patricia on the flanking sides with their stacks of documentation. The audit report sat in the center of the table like an accusation made physical. Richard wore his best suit, the charcoal gray one he'd bought for client meetings back when he still regularly dealt with investors. Catherine wore a simple navy dress and pearls, dignified, unshakable. Daniel arrived at 2:03, Victoria beside him, and to Richard's surprise, they'd brought their own attorney, Marcus Brennan, a shark who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. His presence told Richard everything about Daniel's state of mind. This wasn't going to be a reconciliation, but a fight. Dad, Mom, Daniel said, his voice strained but attempting casual confidence. He lost weight, stress, probably, and there were dark circles under his eyes. I don't know what this is about, but bringing lawyers seems excessive for a family discussion. Sit down, Daniel, Richard said quietly. It wasn't a request. They sat. Marcus Brennan immediately took control, or tried to. Before we begin, I want to state for the record that my clients are here voluntarily as a courtesy. Any accusations or allegations made in this meeting are disputed in advance, and nothing said here constitutes an admission of. Mr. Brennan, James interrupted calmly. Your speech is noted and irrelevant. We're not here to debate the findings of an independent audit. We're here to present those findings and offer your clients an opportunity to make restitution before this becomes a criminal matter. Victoria's face went pale. Daniel's jaw clenched. What audit? You commissioned an audit without board approval. The board chairman has unilateral authority to commission governance audits. Patricia Morrison spoke up, her voice clinically professional. It's in your company bylaws, section 7.3. You might want to familiarize yourself with them, Mr. Montgomery. She slid a document across the table. This is the executive summary. The full report is available if you'd like to read 67 pages detailing exactly how you and your wife embezzled $3.4 million from your family's company. The room went silent except for the quiet hum of the recording equipment. Marcus Brennan read the executive summary, his expression growing more concerned with each page. Victoria stared straight ahead, her hands folded on the table, knuckles white. Daniel read over his attorney's shoulder, his face cycling through emotions: shock, fear, anger, calculation. This is bullshit, Daniel finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. VDM Consulting provided legitimate services. Those property sales were approved by the board. My compensation is commensurate with industry standards for a CEO of a company this size. Then you'll have no trouble providing documentation of the services VDM Consulting allegedly provided, Patricia said. We've requested it 3 times. We've received nothing because nothing exists. You paid your wife $800,000 for work she never did. The property sales were approved by a board you'd illegally restructured, James added. The vote removing Catherine was never properly noticed or documented. Every decision made by that illegitimate board is voidable. Marcus Brennan held up a hand. I need to speak with my clients privately. No, Richard said, standing. The force of his voice surprised even himself. No private discussions. No negotiations. No deals. Daniel, you've stolen millions from the company your mother and I spent our lives building. You fired loyal employees to hide your theft. You planned to bankrupt Montgomery and Associates and buy the pieces for yourself. He pointed at the audit report. Everything is documented. Bank transfers, emails, property records, board minutes. Patricia has given us enough evidence to send you to prison for 10 to 15 years. Victoria finally spoke, her voice brittle. You wouldn't. He's your son. He stopped being my son when he called his mother obsolete and plotted her removal, Catherine said, her voice carrying a cold fury Richard had rarely heard. He became a thief I happened to raise. Daniel stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. You think you're so righteous? You think you built that company alone? I've worked there since I was 22 years old. 12 years of my life, and for what? To be paid a pittance while you hoarded everything? That money was going to be mine anyway. I just took it early. Took it early? Richard's laugh was harsh. Daniel, you weren't taking an inheritance. You were committing fraud. There's a difference, one that apparently your expensive education failed to teach you. Marcus Brennan was writing furiously, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, what exactly are you proposing? James answered. Daniel and Victoria have 72 hours to do the following. 1. Resign all positions at Montgomery and Associates effective immediately. 2. Return all stolen funds, $3.4 million plus interest. 3. Transfer back all company assets currently held by Ashford Holdings or any other entity they control. 4. Sign an agreement never to have any involvement with Montgomery and Associates again. He paused for effect. In exchange, Richard and Catherine will not pursue criminal charges and will not file a civil suit for damages. That's insane, Victoria hissed. We don't have $3 million liquid. The properties alone. Then sell them, Catherine said flatly. Take out loans. Liquidate your retirement accounts. I don't care how you do it. You stole $3 million. You'll return $3 million. And if we refuse? Daniel asked, though his voice shook slightly. Then Monday morning, we file criminal complaints for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, James said. We file a civil suit for damages, including punitive damages, which could triple the amount you owe. We provide all our evidence to the SEC, the IRS, and every relevant regulatory agency. And we make sure every potential employer, every business associate, every person in your social circle knows exactly what you did. Richard watched his son process this, saw the calculations happening behind his eyes. Daniel wasn't thinking about what was right or wrong. He was thinking about whether he could win. That realization hurt worse than all the theft combined. Marcus Brennan requested a 2-hour recess to consult with his clients. James agreed, but stipulated that Daniel and Victoria were not to leave the building or make any calls without supervision, a requirement that made clear how little trust remained. They retreated to a smaller conference room down the hall, while Richard, Catherine, James, and Patricia waited in uncomfortable silence. Catherine stared out the window at the city below. Do you think he'll agree? No, Richard said quietly. He's going to try to find a way out, a loophole, some angle we haven't considered. That's who he is now. He was right. When they reconvened, Marcus Brennan had prepared a counterproposal. My clients are willing to resign from operational management, but maintain their board seats and shareholding. They'll repay $1 million over 5 years and transfer back the Ashford Holdings properties. In exchange, all parties sign a mutual non-disparagement agreement and agree that this matter is concluded. James didn't even need to consult with Richard and Catherine. Rejected. Your clients don't get to keep stolen property and pay back a fraction of what they took over a payment plan. This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Brennan. It's a choice between compliance and prosecution. Daniel leaned forward, his face flushed. You're being unreasonable. $1 million is a substantial amount of money. You stole $3.4 million. Catherine's voice cracked with emotion. How is returning what you stole being unreasonable? We invested in the company, Victoria argued, her composure fracturing. The consulting work was real. The property sales were fair market value, based on legitimate appraisals. You're calling business decisions theft because you can't accept that Daniel modernized a dying company. Patricia Morrison opened one of her files. Mrs. Montgomery, would you like to explain why the appraiser who valued those properties at below market rates was your former college roommate? Or why she received a $50,000 consulting fee from VDM Consulting the same month the appraisals were completed? Or why the properties were immediately relisted by Ashford Holdings at prices 30% higher than what you paid? Victoria's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. Daniel put a hand on her arm, a gesture that might have been supportive but looked more like a warning to stay quiet. The deal is non-negotiable, Richard said, standing. His back ached from the tension, his head throbbed, but his voice was steady. 72 hours. Full restitution and resignation, or we pursue every legal avenue available. There is no third option. Marcus Brennan shuffled his papers, clearly recognizing a losing position. I'll need to consult with financial advisors, property attorneys. You have 72 hours, James repeated. The clock started when you walked into this building at 2 o'clock. That means Monday at 2 o'clock, we need signed agreements and a concrete repayment plan, or we file criminal complaints. Use your time wisely. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He looked at Richard with an expression somewhere between hatred and desperation. You know what the real problem is, Dad? You can't stand that I was better at running the company than you ever were. All your talk about integrity and fair dealing, that's just code for being too scared to do what's necessary to really succeed. I took Montgomery and Associates from a regional contractor to a major player. I tripled revenue. I built relationships you never could have. You built a house of cards and a foundation of lies, Richard replied, his voice heavy with disappointment. And when it falls, and it will fall, Daniel, you'll finally understand the difference between real success and just being a con artist with a good suit. For a moment, Daniel looked like he might say something else, might break through whatever wall he'd built around himself. Then Victoria tugged his arm, and the moment passed. They left without another word, Marcus Brennan trailing behind them, already on his phone, probably calling financial experts. When the conference room door closed, Catherine let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. That was our son, she said wonderingly. That man sitting across from us, lying about theft, blaming us for his crimes. That was the baby I held, the little boy I read bedtime stories to, the teenager I taught to drive. When did we lose him? Richard pulled her close, feeling her tears soak into his shirt. I don't know. Maybe we never had him the way we thought we did. Or maybe somewhere along the way, we failed to teach him something essential. Either way, we can't change it now. We can only protect ourselves and try to save what's left of the company. James began packing up the documents. You both held up remarkably well. I know that wasn't easy. Easy. Catherine laughed bitterly. I just threatened to send my only child to prison. Nothing about this will ever be easy again. But it was necessary, Patricia added gently. And for what it's worth, you handled it with more grace than most parents in similar situations. You gave him a chance to make it right. That's more than he deserved. The weekend that followed was surreal. Richard and Catherine went through the motions of normal life. Shopping, cooking, watching television. But everything felt hollow, performative. The phone rang constantly, but they disconnected it after the 15th call from Daniel went unanswered. Text messages piled up, ranging from apologetic to threatening to bizarrely cheerful, as if nothing had happened. Saturday night, Victoria tried a different tactic. She came to the house alone, without Daniel, and rang the doorbell insistently until Richard answered. She looked terrible, makeup smudged, hair disheveled, the carefully constructed perfection crumbling. "Please," she said, and for the first time since Richard had known her, she seemed genuinely vulnerable. "Please, Richard, I know we messed up. I know we went too far. But $3 million, we can't possibly pay that back. It'll bankrupt us. We'll lose everything." "You should have thought of that before you stole it," Richard said, but without the heat of anger. He was simply tired. "Daniel is falling apart. He hasn't slept in 3 days. He's talking about running, about leaving the country, about—" She stopped, seeming to realize she was revealing too much. "Just please give us more time. 5 years to repay. That's all we're asking. We'll give back everything, sign whatever you want, but we need time." Richard looked at this woman his son had married, this person who'd helped orchestrate their betrayal. He tried to find compassion, tried to access the part of himself that believed in redemption and second chances. But all he felt was a vast emptiness. 72 hours, he said, and closed the door. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures climbing toward 80 degrees. Beautiful weather that felt inappropriate for what was about to unfold. Richard and Catherine dressed in their business attire again, armor for the battlefield their lives had become. They drove to James Patterson's office in silence, both lost in private thoughts about how definitively their family was about to shatter. James met them in the lobby, his expression grim. "They called 30 minutes ago, requesting an extension. I told them the deadline is firm. 2 o'clock today, or we file. They said they'd be here." At 1:45, Daniel and Victoria arrived without Marcus Brennan. That alone was telling. Either they'd agreed to the terms, or they'd fired their attorney because he'd told them they had no legal ground to stand on. They looked haggard, Victoria's designer wardrobe replaced with jeans and a simple blouse, Daniel wearing khakis and a polo shirt, his usual corporate armor abandoned. They sat across the conference table once again, but the dynamic had shifted. The arrogance was gone, replaced with something closer to defeat. Daniel pulled out a folder containing documents and slid it across the table to James. "We've signed the resignation papers," Daniel said, his voice flat. "Effective immediately. I'm stepping down as CEO, and Victoria is resigning her board position. We're also signing over our board seats and surrendering all oversight authority." James reviewed the documents carefully. "And the financial restitution?" Victoria spoke up, her voice cracking slightly. "We've liquidated everything we can access immediately. Retirement accounts, stocks, the equity in our house. We can pay back $1.8 million today. For the remaining $1.6 million, we've secured a loan using the Ashford Holdings properties as collateral. The full payment will be transferred to Montgomery and Associates' operating account within 30 days once the loan closes." Patricia Morrison, who'd been reviewing the financial documentation, looked up. "This checks out. The retirement account liquidations will cost them substantial penalty fees and taxes, probably another $400,000 in losses beyond what they're repaying. The loan terms are harsh, 20-year amortization at 8.5%. They'll pay back nearly $3 million by the time it's satisfied." "Good," Catherine said simply. She felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but she felt no pity either. They created this situation through greed and betrayal. The consequences were theirs to bear. Daniel cleared his throat. "There's one thing not in those documents. I'm asking," he paused, swallowed hard. "I'm asking if you consider not banning us from all contact with the company. Eventually, when this is resolved, maybe I could work there again in some capacity. Not as CEO, just something. That company is all I know." Richard had anticipated this request. He'd thought about it during his sleepless nights, had discussed it with Catherine in quiet morning conversations over coffee. Part of him, the part that still remembered teaching Daniel to use a hammer, that recalled his son's pride at completing his first solo project, wanted to say yes, wanted to believe redemption was possible. But Catherine answered before he could. "No, You don't get to steal everything we built and then ask for permission to come back and work there. You're done with Montgomery and Associates, Daniel. Forever. That's the price of what you did. Mom, Daniel's voice broke slightly. I know I can't fix this, but I'm still your son. Doesn't that count for anything? Catherine stood, her hands pressed flat against the table, and Richard saw a strength in her he'd always known was there, but which she rarely displayed so nakedly. You stopped being my son the moment you decided to destroy us. What you're now is a thief who happens to share my DNA. We're giving you a chance to avoid prison. We're accepting your repayment, but we're not giving you forgiveness, and we're certainly not giving you access to hurt us again. The words hung in the air with terrible finality. Daniel looked at his father, perhaps hoping for a softer response, but Richard remained silent. He'd said everything that needed saying in the previous meetings. Now was the time for consequences, not comfort. James methodically worked through the remaining paperwork. Daniel and Victoria signed away their future with Montgomery and Associates, each signature a small death. When the last form was completed, James collected everything and placed it in his briefcase. As of this moment, the criminal complaints are suspended pending final repayment of the $1.6 million within 30 days. If that payment is not received by close of business on July 15th, we will immediately file with law enforcement and pursue all criminal charges. Is that clear? Crystal, Victoria whispered. They stood to leave. Daniel paused at the door, turning back one last time. Dad, I'm sorry. I know you don't believe that, but I am. I got caught up in things, in keeping up with Victoria's expectations, in trying to prove I was as successful as you. I made terrible choices. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. Richard looked at his son, really looked at him. He saw the boy Daniel had been, the man he might have become, and the stranger he'd chosen to be. The tragedy, Daniel, isn't that you made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The tragedy is that when confronted with what you'd done, your first instinct wasn't remorse. It was to lie, to blame us, to try to negotiate keeping some of what you'd stolen. That tells me who you really are, and an apology doesn't change it. Daniel nodded slowly, seeming to crumple slightly. Then he and Victoria left, walking out of the office and out of Richard and Catherine's lives with a finality that felt absolute. When they were gone, James poured everyone glasses of water from the conference room pitcher. That went about as well as could be expected. The documentation is solid, the repayment plan is reasonable, and you've protected yourselves and the company. Once the final payment clears, this chapter will be closed. Will it, though? Catherine asked. I mean, legally, yes. But can you ever really close a chapter where your child betrays you? Where your family disintegrates? Patricia Morrison, who'd remained largely silent during the final meeting, spoke up with unexpected gentleness. In my 25 years doing this work, I've seen every variation of family business disputes. Some of them end with reconciliation eventually, years later, after therapy and time and genuine change. Others end with permanent estrangement. I can't tell you which path you're on. What I can tell you is that you've protected yourselves with dignity, you've insisted on accountability, and you've given them a chance to make things right short of criminal prosecution. However this resolves emotionally, you've done nothing to be ashamed of. Richard took Catherine's hand. Let's go home. Você passou muitos limites de palavras por blocos. Preciso que finalize a história em 2 blocos. The 30 days that followed were among the strangest of Richard and Catherine's lives. They returned to Montgomery and Associates, not as visitors, but as leaders reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. Richard reassumed operational control as CEO, while Catherine took back her position as secretary-treasurer. The employees who'd survived Daniel's purges welcomed them with relief bordering on celebration. The 2 outside board advisors, Marcus Chun and Patricia Holloway, resigned immediately once the audit findings became known. They'd seen the writing on the wall and wanted to avoid any association with the scandal. Richard and Catherine appointed 2 new board members, trusted colleagues from the industry who understood both construction and integrity. On July 14th, one day before the deadline, The final payment of $1.6 million hit Montgomery and Associates' account. Daniel had sent no message with the transfer, no final goodbye or acknowledgement. Just the money, cold and impersonal, like a debt to a stranger. Richard stood in his reclaimed office, the corner office Daniel had occupied, and looked out at the city his company had helped build. Literally helped build. Montgomery and Associates' name was on bridges, commercial complexes, schools. 43 years of work that would outlast him, outlast Daniel's betrayal, outlast everything. Catherine joined him at the window. James called. The transfer is confirmed. It's over. Is it? Richard asked. Some days I wake up and forget for a moment that our son tried to destroy us. Then I remember, and it's like learning it all over again. I know, Catherine said softly. She leaned against him, the same comfortable weight he'd known for 47 years. I keep thinking about all the things we did wrong, all the ways we might have prevented this. Did we spoil him? Protect him too much from struggle? Give him too much too easily? Richard considered this. They'd asked themselves these questions hundreds of times over the past months. Maybe, probably, but lots of people are given advantages and don't turn into thieves. At some point, Daniel made his own choices. We can't carry the weight of his moral failures. The company stabilized over the following months. With proper financial management restored, Montgomery and Associates not only survived, but began to thrive again. Richard and Catherine implemented new governance procedures, transparent financial reporting, and oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuse. They also created a succession plan that didn't involve family. When they eventually retired, leadership would pass to qualified professionals who'd earned it through merit, not bloodline. They never heard from Daniel or Victoria again directly. Occasionally, through the small-town network of business gossip, they'd learn fragments. Daniel had taken a sales position at a mid-sized construction firm in another state. Victoria had started a legitimate consulting business, this time actually doing the work she'd billed for. They'd sold their mansion, downsized dramatically, were reportedly living a much humbler existence. Richard felt neither satisfaction nor sorrow at these updates. His son had become simply someone he used to know, a relationship that had existed in the past but held no claim on the present. 2 years after the confrontation, on a crisp autumn evening, Richard and Catherine sat on their back porch watching the sunset. The same porch where they'd processed the initial betrayal, where they'd made the decision to fight back. Catherine was reading a mystery novel. Richard was working on a birdhouse, his hands still steady at 73, still finding peace in creating something tangible. Do you regret how he handled it? Catherine asked suddenly, looking up from her book. Richard set down his sandpaper and considered the question honestly. No, we gave him every opportunity to do the right thing. He chose his path, we chose ours. The only thing I regret is that we had a son who forced us to make that choice. Catherine nodded, returning to her book. And in that simple exchange, Richard understood they'd found their peace. Not the peace of reconciliation or the satisfaction of revenge, but something more fundamental. The peace of knowing they'd stood their ground, protected what they'd built, and refused to be victims of someone else's greed, even when that someone was their own child.
So that's our story. 3 years later, Montgomery and Associates is stronger than ever. Catherine and I are still running it, though we're training the next generation of leadership, people who've earned their position through hard work and integrity. We'll retire eventually, maybe in another 5 years. And when we do, we'll know the company is in good hands.
People sometimes ask if we miss Daniel, if we've tried to reach out. The honest answer is complicated. Do I miss the boy he was? Absolutely. That child was full of potential and joy. But that person doesn't exist anymore. Maybe he never did. Maybe we just saw what we wanted to see. The man he became isn't someone I want in my life, and that's not cruelty. It's self-preservation.
Here's what we want you to understand if you're watching this. Family isn't sacred just because it's family. Blood relationships don't give people permission to abuse you, steal from you, or destroy what you built. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is to set firm boundaries and enforce real consequences. We gave Daniel every chance to make things right. He chose to fight us instead. That was his decision, and he has to live with it.
But there's something else we learned through all of this. Richard and I became even stronger together. When your own child betrays you, it shakes your foundation. But we had each other, we had our partnership of 47 years, and that was enough. We survived not because we were perfect or brilliant, but because we refused to let anyone, even our son, break what we'd built together.
If you're facing something similar, family members trying to take advantage of you, children who seem to have forgotten your worth, relatives who think you're too old or too naive to notice their schemes, don't ignore the warning signs. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Get professional help. And remember that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary.
We're sharing this story not for sympathy but because we know we're not alone. Somewhere out there, another parent is being pushed aside by their children, another business owner is being undermined by family, another couple is realizing that the people they loved and trusted are planning their downfall. You're not crazy for seeing it. You're not cruel for standing up for yourself.
If this story touched your heart, or if it gave you strength to face your own situation, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, like, and share to help us spread this message. We read every comment, and knowing we've helped even one person stand up for themselves makes sharing our pain worthwhile.
And to anyone watching who might be thinking about taking advantage of their parents, their elderly relatives, or anyone they think is too old to fight back, remember this: we built everything we have through strength, intelligence, and perseverance. Just because we're older doesn't mean we've forgotten how to protect ourselves. Just because we loved you doesn't mean we'll let you destroy us.
Take care of your parents. Respect the people who sacrifice for you. Value the relationships that matter. Because one day, you'll be in our position, older, maybe vulnerable, hoping the children you raise will remember your worth. The way you treat your elders today is setting the standard for how you'll be treated tomorrow. Choose wisely.
Thank you for listening to our story. We're Richard and Catherine Montgomery, and we survived because we stood together. Whatever you're facing, remember, you're stronger than you think, and you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter your age. Don't ever forget that.